Hi, guys, and welcome back to Drive to School Chat, where we discuss a subtopic in geography on the way to school. Now, today I'd like us to talk about the Sheffield floods of 2007, and we are going to talk about them under four main headings. And the first one is the causes of the floods, the physical causes of the floods. Then we'll talk about the human causes of the floods, then the impacts of the floods and the management of the floods. All right, let's get started then. Now, the first thing that we are beginning with is the physical causes of the floods. And one of the physical causes was antecedent rainfall. Now, antecedent rainfall refers to rainfall that has occurred prior to the storm event or the flood event. And on the 15th of June 2007, 90 millimeters of rainfall fell in Sheffield. Now, just to put that into context, 90 millimeters of rainfall is a month's worth of rainfall in that particular area. So that obviously was a lot of water falling within a very short period of time, which then means that it's likely not to drain away quickly enough, which then means that the ground is likely to be fairly saturated with water. Now, 10 days later, so on the 25th of June, another 100 millimeters of rainfall fell. Now, that meant obviously that because the ground was already saturated, this water could not infiltrate the ground and therefore ended up as surface runoff and quickly made its way to the river. And as a result of that, the river burst its banks because it could not handle all this water that was coming into it. Okay, so that's the first physical cause of the flood. And the second physical cause is that Sheffield is surrounded by 7 hills. Now, that then implies that a lot of water, due to the force of gravity, if it has fallen on those hills, is likely to come towards Sheffield. And Sheffield is actually at the foot of those hills or at the foot of the Pennines, which means that so much water coming down those hills that are around Sheffield within a short period of time then inundated Sheffield with water such that that water could not be drained away quickly enough, and that's why the flood happened. Then going on then to the third physical cause, and that is that Sheffield is located at the confluence of 3 rivers. Now, it's located at the confluence or at the meeting point, because we know that is what a confluence is, of the River Don, the River Loxley, and the River Rivelin, which then means that a lot of water was coming into Sheffield through those rivers and then meeting in Sheffield, which then again meant that too much water was coming into the area within a short period of time. And especially if we now combine that with the antecedent rainfall, with the saturated ground, then it becomes a recipe for disaster, especially where flooding is concerned. So those are the physical causes of the flood. Now let's move on then to the human causes of the flood. And the first one is that Sheffield is very heavily urbanized. Now that means obviously, because urbanization is an increase obviously in the proportion of people that live in towns and cities. So if an area is urbanized, then it means that it's likely to be very heavily built up. And we know that those buildings also have infrastructure to support them, so that like roads and so on, and roads are made of tarmac, the buildings are made of concrete, and we know that concrete and tarmac do not allow for infiltration to take place. And because of that, the water does not sink into the ground, and therefore there's a lot of surface runoff. Now that surface runoff quickly gets to the river, and that causes the flood because the river will burst its banks because it will not be able to drain that water away quickly enough. Then we have the second cause of the flood, and that is that the drainage system in Sheffield was insufficient. Now, the drains obviously could not handle the amount of water that came into Sheffield during this particular flood event. And a lot of those drains got blocked. And due to those blockages, they then could not transfer the water. But the water that was transferred by the drains towards the river then reached the river very quickly, meaning again the river was inundated. And then after they got blocked, now the rest was just surface runoff. So there was no delay as the drains take the water into the river. Instead, it ran off the surface very quickly into those rivers, into the river, and that river obviously could not drain the water quickly enough, leading to the floods. So that's a second human reason. Now, moving on to the third human reason, and that is that the flood defenses that were in Sheffield at that particular time were not that great. So they were poor. The flood defenses were poor, and therefore they could not block the waters from going into the built-up areas or into the valuable areas that needed to be protected from the floods. So some of the flood walls, for example, were breached or they broke, and then the water was so much as well that it toppled over some of the walls as well, which then led to the flooding taking place. So those are three human reasons. So we have the fact that it's heavily urbanized, and then it had a poor drainage system, and then lastly, it had poor flood defenses. Now, moving on then to the impacts of the flood. Now, tragically, 2 people lost their lives during these floods in Sheffield. And then 13,000 people did not have electricity for over 2 days. So the power, cut off. Then we had the Hillsborough Stadium, which was inundated by the water and flooded. And it cost in the millions to restore it to what it was like before. So that was a lot of money that was lost. And then we also had the shopping center that is in this particular area, and that is the Meadowhall Shopping Center. Now, this shopping center was inundated with water, and it had to shut down. I think it shut down for 10 days. Now, you can imagine how much business was lost as a result of this shopping center being shut down. Then there were also disruptions, obviously, to transportation. So in terms of the railways and the roads. And we know that the transport infrastructure is very important when it comes to trade and to business because of the movement of goods and services, which then implies that a lot of business, again, was lost. So we are talking about not just economic impacts, but, social impacts, but also economic impacts. Okay, so what was the next impact then? The next impact is that 1,200 homes were flooded or were damaged in the floods. Now, that meant obviously that a lot of these homes would have to be restored after the flooding had taken place. And we also know that the cost of insurance for some of these residents of Sheffield is likely to have gone up as a result of the floods. Because when they make a claim, obviously, their insurance premiums are likely to go. And then 1,000 businesses were also damaged in the floods. Now, of course, those businesses had to shut down. So they lost business, they lost money, and then they also had to be, restored. And that obviously cost money in terms of insurance, paying these people off so that they can restore their businesses, which again is likely to have raised their premiums as well. Then the last impact that we're going to talk about here is that the flood waters led to threat of disease, because we know that when an area is inundated with flood water, that flood water is likely to mix with sewage, and that obviously poses a great health risk. All right. Now let's move on then to the management of the floods. Now, obviously, after the floods, Sheffield had to do something about the management of flooding in the area, and a lot was put into place to ensure that if there was another flood like this, it was not going to cause as much devastation as these floods of 2007 caused. So a lot was done. And one of the first things, so we'll talk about hard engineering first, and then we'll talk about soft engineering. And we know that hard engineering strategies is where you put physical structures in place to prevent flooding from taking place. And one of the physical structures that was put up or was put in place is flood walls. And obviously, a flood wall is put beside the river, and those flood walls are put there so that the holding capacity of the river can be increased, so that the river can hold a lot more water. And these flood walls obviously are put in the areas that are valuable. So if we are talking about the built-up areas, the areas that have got the businesses and so on, these are where the flood walls would be put. So for example, if we are talking about Sheffield Town Centre, that is where the flood walls would be put. Now, what are the advantages of that? Now, one, the area is going to be well protected. And then secondly, because these flood walls are quite effective. And then the other thing is that they are fairly cheap. And they are cheap because you are putting them up in specific places that are valuable. So you're not putting the entire, you're not putting up flood walls in the entire course of that particular river, but only in the specific areas that are a lot more, have got a lot of value. Now, what about the limitations or the disadvantages? Now, one of the disadvantages of those flood walls is that they are likely to cause a lot more flooding further down that river. And the reason for that is that the increased holding capacity of that river will mean that a lot of water will be contained within the river channel. And then when it gets to areas that are further down along that particular course of that river, it's likely to overflow the banks there because those areas will not have flood. So these management strategies have both advantages and disadvantages. The second strategy is dredging. And dredging is where you remove excess sediment from the riverbeds. Now, why do you do that? You're removing that excess sediment so that the river can hold a lot more water. The holding capacity of the river will go up if you remove that excess sediment. And that is what happened in Sheffield. And obviously, that has advantages and disadvantages. And the advantage is that, of course, the area is unlikely to flood. But then the disadvantage, again, as we have seen for the flood walls, is that areas that are further along are likely to be flooded as a result, because a lot of water will be retained within the channel. And when it gets to areas that are not protected or have not been dredged in this instance, those are likely to get flooded. Okay, so the third management strategy is building of levees. Now, levees here are flood embankments, and you can actually build up the levees so they are around the river. Now, you can actually build them up with the material that you have dredged, so that excess sediment and material can be removed and placed on the banks of the river. So that will then mean again that that river will have more holding capacity. And because of that, the area will be protected. Now, that obviously will have advantages again and disadvantages that are similar to the other two that we have just mentioned. The fourth hard engineering management strategy is diversion channels. Now, these diversion channels will obviously be built to divert the water from areas that are valuable. So, for example, Sheffield town center. Now, that means that the water is likely not to go to these areas that are valuable, but instead it will be diverted to areas that are less valuable. So areas that, for example, would just have vegetation. And if those areas get flooded, then there is not as much economic loss. So diversion channels are also very important in controlling flooding in Sheffield. Now, moving on then to the soft engineering strategies. Now, soft engineering strategies tend to work with nature to control or regulate flooding in an area. The first soft engineering strategy is floodplain restoration. And this involves increasing the amount of greenery in an area. So having a lot more trees in an area or on the floodplain so that you can increase the amount of infiltration that is in the area, and not just infiltration, but also interception, because we know that vegetation, especially the trees, will intercept the raindrops. So it will delay those raindrops from reaching the ground. And by doing so, it's going to delay runoff. And when runoff is delayed, as we know, it's going to lead to a lower flood risk. The second soft engineering strategy is river channel restoration. And this involves restoring things like meanders in an area. Now, by restoring the meanders, it means that there may be natural flooding of areas that are not as economically valuable. So in areas, for example, where you have parks or just open land, you can restore the meanders there, and you can also remove some of the levees that are in those areas, so that when the river has got excess water, then that water can flood into those surrounding areas that are obviously natural. They are parks. They just have vegetation, and therefore they don't have buildings and are not as valuable. So if there's a flood there, it's not going to affect anything. It's not going to damage anything. And in so doing, you then reduce on the amount of water that is in the river channel, meaning that the more valuable areas are not going to be flooded. Okay. Now, what have we talked about then this morning? We have talked about the Sheffield floods of 2007. Now, these are very important as a case study for our specification. And what have we said about them? We've talked about the physical causes of those floods. And we said that the physical causes include antecedent rainfall. They also include the fact that Sheffield is surrounded by hills and is at the foot of the Pennines. And then we talked about the fact that Sheffield is located at the confluence of three rivers. So River Rivelin, River Loxley, and Don. And then we also talked about the human causes of the floods. We talked about the fact that Sheffield is heavily urbanized. Then we also talked about the fact that the flood defenses were not sufficient enough. And we also talked about the drainage system of Sheffield, which was also insufficient and could not cope with the flood waters. Then we later talked about the impacts of the floods. We looked at several impacts, and then we looked at the management of the floods. So both hard engineering and soft engineering. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me in this Drive to School chat and on this journey towards excellent exam results. If you have a topic that you'd like us to cover on the way to school, please do let me know in the comments section below, and we shall be sure to discuss it one of these fine mornings. All the best, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.